Stan Lee is the godfather to some of the most iconic superheroes, dating back to decades ago when the only place they came to life was in a comic book. So today I'm going to explain who Stan Lee is and how he has created and developed the Marvel Universe over the years. Stan Lee's real name is Stanley Martin Lieber. He was born in New York on December 28th in 1922. Growing up halfway through the Great Depression, him and his family struggled quite a bit. Mr. Lieber was constantly looking for jobs but never able to maintain one. His parents were immigrants from Romania and were always pushing Stan Lee to do good in school in order to skip grades. That way he could join the workforce and help his father. One of Stan's first jobs was at the Rivoli Theater on Broadway, where he worked as an usher. Stan himself says that this was one of his favorite jobs to date because he got paid just to watch movies. Much of the information that I have today from Stan's childhood, he speaks more on in his autobiography, Excelsior, The Amazing Life of Stan Lee, where you can find more information about his upbringing and his real true love for comics. Stan first got into writing when he was 15 years old and entered a New York Tribune Herald newspaper contest. The editor of the newspaper actually was impressed by Stan's work and encouraged him to becoming a writer. He then landed a part-time job with the newspaper, but it wasn't exactly what he expected it to be. Stan later on got a job at Timely Comics and was hired in 1939 as an office assistant. Timely Comics was originally well known for their pulp fiction and porn magazines, but they soon switched over to comics once they realized that these were out of style. Little did Stan nor anyone else realize that Timely Comics would one day become the home of some of America's most favorite and beloved superheroes. Stan's job as an office assistant pretty much just meant that he was the gopher of the office. Only making $8 a week, many of his tasks included fetching lunch for everyone, keeping the inkwells filled, and erasing pencil marks for many of the illustrators. A fun fact that I found quite entertaining about Stan was that he was very fond of playing the flute around the office, which got on the nerves of many, many people, such as writers like Jack Kirby, who Stan would later on work with. Yeah, he used to throw things at him a lot. One person in particular who was not very fond of Stan's flute playing was illustrator Jack Kirby. He worked on Captain America alongside of Joe Simon. Stan's first real job at Timely Comics was when he actually got to work and write on the script of Captain America's third issue. Now, remember that guy Jack Kirby I was telling you about, who wasn't already very fond of Stan? Well, this just seemed to piss him off a lot more. Because as a result of this, Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, both writers on Captain America, had left Timely Comics, leaving a 19-year-old Stan Lee to take his position as editor-in-chief and art director on multiple projects. Unfortunately, Stan's time in his new position was cut short by World War II in 1942, where Stan was drafted and went away. He continued doing what he loved, though, while he was at war. While he was there, he wrote manuals and scripts for training videos, and he also created an advertisement to encourage soldiers to have safe sex. When the war ended, Stan was 23 years old, and he moved back home to New York to pick up where he left off at Timely Comics. During this time, Stan met Joan Clayton Bucock, a working model, who was married but separated when she had met Stan. Stan had actually flown alongside of Joan back to Reno, California to be there with her when she finalized her divorce. On December 5th in 1947, Joan and Stan were finally married. They didn't celebrate with a honeymoon. Instead, they moved back to New York on the Upper East Side, and 3 years later they had their daughter, JC. In 1961, Timely Comics officially changed their name to Marvel Comics. They had changed the name and introduced new comics in hopes of saving the struggling company. Taking inspiration from the DC's Justice League, Stan Lee created Fantastic Four, which was also published in 1961. Now, this comic was a huge success for the company. This was because the characters' real-life relatable issues, such as having a bad temper or dealing with financial problems. With the leadership of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby now back on board, Marvel's Fantastic Four came with a whole lot more. After their major success, they introduced several new superheroes to the Marvel family, including Spider-Man, Thor, Iron Man, X-Men, and many others. The reason why many of these comic book superheroes took the world by storm was because of their sense of humanity and realism that Stan Lee gave them. Dealing with real-world problems such as drug abuse and a sense of the unknown, these comics were extremely ahead of their time. A big moment not only for the company, but for the nation as a whole, was in 1966, when Stan Lee introduced the first black superhero in comic book history, the Black Panther. But he wasn't the only one. Following the Black Panther, 2 more black superheroes would hit the comic book stores across the nation. In 1969, the Falcon, and following him, Luke Cage in 1972. Now, I know what you're thinking, but who's the best superhero? With so many different types of heroes to choose from, kids across the nation were obsessed with Marvel Comics. But one superhero in particular had changed the history of the company forever. Everyone's favorite friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, Stan Lee's very own personal creation, had taken the world by storm and made Marvel Comics the biggest comic book company in all of America. Working in a movie theater, Stan was inspired and had always wanted his characters to jump off of the pages of comic books and onto bigger and better mediums. Marvel Superheroes was a Saturday morning cartoon where the superheroes first took to the screen. Unfortunately, the low-budgeted show was a bust, and it only lasted for 1 season. But this didn't mean that Stan Lee wouldn't try again. In 1977, Marvel had their first success in television with the hit series The Hulk, starring Lou Ferrigno. The show lasted about 4 seasons. Following the success, Stan Lee had officially stepped up as Mr. Marvel himself, the ambassador of the superhero world. In 1988, Ron Perlman took over Marvel and tripled Stan's salary, and then officially made him the head of Marvel Films. Now, although Stan was officially the head of Marvel Films, many people knew that they weren't always successful under his control. Movies such as The Punisher, which was released in 1989, and Captain America, which was released in 1991, they didn't do so great. With the come of the 90s came the end of the comic book era and industry as a whole. Total sales had dropped from $1 billion in 1993 to less than $450 million in 1996, which led to Marvel filing for bankruptcy. In 1997, Carl Icahn bought the Marvel company as a whole. He then offered Stan Lee a 2-year contract with the company, which was a little disrespectful considering he created it from the ground up. This resulted in Stan Lee suing him, and thus earned his lifetime position as chairman of Marvel. This role ultimately gave Stan Lee all the honor, and he had no work to do. Along with all of his royalties, Stan was able to work in a little favor in his contract. Appearing in almost every single Marvel movie to date, Stan Lee has a cameo guaranteed in all of their films. And by the 2000s, Marvel had taken the movie industry by storm. In 2000, Marvel released X-Men, which had a worldwide profit of almost $3 million. Following this, Spider-Man was released in 2002, and Marvel did not expect it to do just as good as it did. By almost tripling the X-Men worldwide profit, Spider-Man had made almost $8 million. In 2001, Stan Lee launched the Stan Lee's POW Entertainment. They developed movies and television shows for upcoming new characters that weren't released yet. A few years later, Disney finally stepped in 2009. The Walt Disney Company had purchased 10% of Marvel and put in about $2.5 billion into the company. What we once knew as Timely Comics is what we now know as the Marvel Cinematic Universe today. With over 18 films, they've grossed a net worth of over $14.7 billion, making them the highest-grossing film franchise of all time. In conclusion, I hope you enjoyed this staff talk and learned a little bit more about Stan Lee and the history of Marvel Cinematic Universe.